Good evening. The name Azaria Chamberlain has again hit the headlines as two Sydney men claim they have new evidence that baby Azaria was indeed taken by a dingo from a tent at Ayers Rock almost 3 years ago. Tonight we present an NBN News special report, The New Azaria Claims. It was on August the 17th, 1980, while the Chamberlain family was on holiday at Ayers Rock, that the story began. Mrs. Lindy Chamberlain claimed that a dingo had taken her sleeping daughter Azaria from the family tent, sparking one of Australia's most baffling mysteries. Wide searches during the night and following days failed to find any trace of the baby. Days later, her clothing was found several kilometres from the campsite. An inquest was held at Alice Springs, and the coroner, Dennis Barrett, found that Azaria Chamberlain had been taken by a dingo, but that there had been human involvement in the placement of the clothing. He delivered his finding live on television to a watching nation. But later, the Northern Territory's Chief Minister, Mr. Everingham, announced that he was setting aside that coroner's finding and that a new inquest would be held. Crowds of newsmen gathered to report all the evidence at the new inquest, which ended with the new coroner finding that the Chamberlains ought to be charged with murder. In due course, they were brought to trial in Darwin. After a long trial which dwelt at length on forensic argument, Mrs. Chamberlain was found guilty of murdering Azaria and sentenced to life imprisonment. Her husband was found guilty of being an accessory after the fact and released on a good behaviour bond. There was an unsuccessful appeal by both to the Supreme Court. Mrs. Chamberlain is now in jail in Darwin. Her husband now cares for their 2 sons and new baby daughter Kalia at Cooranbong near Newcastle. Last night, the Northern Territory Attorney-General confirmed that he had asked the Solicitor-General to initiate new inquiries based on evidence provided by 2 Sydney men. It's been confirmed that the Northern Territory Police have begun a new inquiry. The 2 men are Mr. Phil Ward and Mr. Don McNichol. Mr. Ward is the publisher of a business newsletter. Mr. McNichol is a legal investigator. Like the Chamberlains, both are members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Mr. Ward is a long-time friend. Mr. McNichol knows the Chamberlains, but not well. Tonight, with Ray Deneen, we ask them about the new Azaria claims.
The night the guilty verdict came down, I felt that I couldn't take the verdict. I didn't believe it was correct. I stayed up all night. I rang Mr. McNichol at 7 o'clock the next morning. I asked him if he'd come with me to Central Australia to check up a story of Aboriginal involvement in the death of Azaria. A story that we've discussed previously on this news. We found that story to be incorrect, but it took us 2.5 months to find it was incorrect, and on the way we found out what really did happen.
At this stage, then, you're subscribers to the theory that it was a dingo that took baby Azaria?
It's almost exactly the verdict of the first coroner, that it was a dingo that took Azaria, and within a short space of time, in a short space of distance, the dingo was the body of the baby was taken from the dingo by individuals at Ayers Rock.
Well, what sort of investigations did you do out there?
Well, we conducted fairly in-depth surveys into all the residents that were at the Rock at the time that Azaria disappeared. We interviewed dozens of people. We questioned them surrounding the facts as they knew it. By doing that, we were able to piece together a story which has become the basis of the new evidence.
Well, just what is your new evidence then that you say hasn't come to the fore before this?
Well, basically, a semi-domesticated dingo, or pet, or whatever you like to call it, some 8 weeks before Azaria disappeared, had jumped into a car and attacked a little girl, actually pulled her out of the car. He was allegedly shot. In fact, we have evidence that shows that in fact he wasn't shot. He was relocated or dumped a long way away. And what happened? He came back to the Rock, entered the tent, and took Azaria out. He then took the baby to a residence where he was used to going, living in the house, being fed at the house, probably where he thought he was safe.
How can you be sure that it was the same dingo 6 or 8 weeks apart that allegedly attacked 2 children?
The black trackers have said that the tracks they were following that night had an impediment in the paw, and that impediment in the paw was one that they could recognise as being distinguishing that particular dingo. Plus the dingo, which was supposedly shot 8 weeks beforehand. In fact, we have I think 7 times the dingo has been seen, either just before the day Azaria died or in the next few days afterwards, and 5 witnesses who've seen it.
I think the big question is, in your view, in view of this investigation you've done, what do you think happened on the night in the tent and in the several hours which followed?
The dingo went into the tent, climbed over the sleeping boy in the tent. The black tracker has described seeing the tracks on the garment of the boy, where the boy was asleep. Took Azaria from the tent, came out of the tent and was surprised because Mrs. Chamberlain came to the tent as it was coming out, and it ran in a direction away from her. Almost immediately 3 people ran into the bush chasing the dingo. One was Michael Chamberlain, one was a tourist there, William Haby, and another one was another tourist there, Whittaker, wasn't it? And the dingo then, running from those, ran up the sandhill. With Haby still in pursuit, the dingo then changed its direction more than 90 degrees and headed back in a westerly direction towards Ayers Rock. And that sudden change of direction was what caused the problem on the night, because the change of direction wasn't picked up. The footprints had obliterated just the point where the direction change took place.
And you've spoken to these witnesses who chased the dingo?
Yes.
And you're satisfied that they saw a dingo?
No, they didn't see the dingo. Lindy Chamberlain's the only one who claims to have seen the dingo. When she called, they ran into the bush. Haby believed that the dingo was on his right-hand side, so when he got to the top of a sandhill behind the Chamberlains, a long sand ridge, he went along the top of that sand ridge until he intercepted the tracks that were coming up the hill. He found a place where he believed that the baby had been laid down, and the Aboriginal black trackers have described it as, when they saw it, it was material given in court that there was a place where the dingoes had laid something down. The black tracker, who was never called to give evidence on that particular point, is described in his affidavits that he could see the place where the 2 babies' legs had left an impression in the sand at that point, as well as just as the body impression. The only other people to describe that on oath have given descriptions of it as just being the body. They'd made no mention of the feet, but the black tracker has never been asked to give that information.
When asked by one of the questioners, the black tracker said that there was 2 little places where part of the baby's body had been put down on the sand. The questioner said, what part of the body? And the Aboriginal said, the 2 little boots.
What happened then?
It went to the home of a resident at Ayers Rock. At the time, there was nobody home. The residents were at one of the local motels dining, drinking, and the husband was called out onto the search, and the wife made her own way home separately. When she got home, she found the dingo and the baby's body in the backyard. So she scared the dingo off. According to the black tracker tracks, the tracks leading away from the home showed that they gave no indication that the dingo was carrying the baby, yet on the tracks leading into the house, the prints were deeper into the sand, so it was obviously carrying something, and it ran off at its speed. At a greater speed it left the house than the speed it went in there, so it may have had a good kick up the rear or something like that to make it leave. Then we believe that she buried the body in her backyard, and it was exhumed several days later and disposed of, we know not how.
But why would this person dispose of the body and want to keep it secret? What are you basing this story on?
Her husband was the one who was supposed to have shot the dingo, and therefore it was a move to protect her husband from the blame of the death of the baby.
Was she alone in the action of burying the baby?
No, she was assisted by several other women that night. Virtually all the men were out searching, and she had a neighbour assist her. The neighbour needed a babysitter, so the neighbour got a third woman to babysit. And there were also at some stage of the evening, her 18-year-old daughter came home. So all in all, there were 4 women involved, 3 married and 1
So
single.
this is where your allegation of conspiracy comes in, that 3 women buried the baby. Presumably their husbands found out about that.
Mm.
And what happened then?
I think when the husbands found out, there was an obvious thing, well, could you dob in your wife, to use the colloquial? And I think obviously that they couldn't. It was a fairly minor thing. All the women had tried to do was hide it was that particular dingo. There was no suggestion they were trying to hide the fact it was a dingo in total.
Once it started, I think they had to keep covering their tracks or become right open with it. And I think that they had made efforts to look for the dingo. Indeed, they didn't want anybody else finding it at the rock at the time.
How do you know all this, though? This is the new story, isn't it? How do you know it?
We have 6 affidavits, and most of those are from residents who were at the rock at the time that Azaria disappeared, and they have given us evidence. Apart from that, we have 20 hours of interviews with people, including the people that we suspected, and they have told us certain things which have and admitted to certain things which have brought the story together.
Now, if the Northern Territory authorities have now known for, roughly 4 weeks?
8 weeks.
8 weeks. Have they not checked the backyard we're talking about?
I don't know what they've done. I know what they're now doing.
What is that?
Well, they reopened investigations just under a fortnight ago, although it was only announced a day or so ago. They've called one person to Darwin for questioning, and following that line of questioning, a very senior police officer was appointed to handle the case. He, in fact, was the Detective Sergeant Graham Charlwood, who had handled the original Chamberlain investigation. He had since been on the fraud squad, and then, with no notice to anyone, he was taken off the fraud squad 10 days, 2 weeks ago, and no one knew what he was doing. He was suddenly on a case out of town and was no longer working on fraud. He was working for the Special Crime Unit, which is their equivalent of homicide.
And as far as you know, what has he been able to find out so far in this line that you've given to him?
We don't know of his findings. We do know some of the places he's been to. He has interviewed some of the people who were at Ayers Rock at the time, and I understand today he's actually at Ayers Rock.
Well, I must imagine then that the body that you claim was buried in the backyard is no longer there, because surely it would be an easy thing to check.
No, it certainly wouldn't be there, and even if it was, it would be very difficult. We've had it suggested to us, although we're not forensic experts, that the deterioration of a baby's body over 3 years, and it's now been 3 years almost, the body would have completely deteriorated.
So you're suggesting that some one of those 6 people we were talking about a moment ago, in fact, went back, dug up the body, and disposed of it somewhere else?
Yes, and at the time removed the garments from the body. The forensic evidence suggests that the baby was buried in its clothes for about 3 days. That's existing forensic evidence at the trial.
Well, most of the things you've said are not very different from the evidence that was given to the first coroner's inquest.
From the findings of the first coroner's inquest, certainly.
Why do you suppose that first coroner's inquest was set aside and a new one ordered?
Well, that may not be for us to say.
Well, you must have a theory.
It's common speculation and rumour that the police in the Northern Territory did get a rap over the knuckles from Mr. Dennis Barrett. Also, the Conservation Commission most certainly felt unjustly done by. We spoke to certain rangers who weren't very happy with the decision at all and said that a magistrate should not give advice about something that he knows nothing about. So I can only suppose perhaps this is at the seat of the aggression against the Chamberlains. Maybe they were just a pawn in something that went out of control. It's very hard to say. Certain people got evidence together. The police most certainly have to look at that evidence, whether it's scientific evidence or not. But they were satisfied that they had a case. I believe that the integrity of the police force should not be perhaps brought into this at this stage.
But a second inquest, a trial, an appeal. The inquest recommended that the Chamberlains be charged. The trial and the subsequent appeal found Mrs. Chamberlain guilty of murder, and she's now serving that sentence. Are you suggesting that there has been a real miscarriage of justice and that all of that forensic evidence was wrong?
It shouldn't surprise us that there's been a miscarriage of justice, Murray, because this type of thing happens. Justice is not perfect. As for the forensic evidence, except for the blood in the car, all the forensic evidence fits what we've found. The forensic evidence suggested there was the handprint of a small woman on the jumpsuit, and that was done at the time that the body was still reasonably, the blood in the body was fairly fresh. Now, the suggestion at the trial, of course, that was Mrs. Chamberlain's handprint. We've now found that it wasn't Mrs. Chamberlain's handprint, it was another woman's handprint.
That was something I was going to bring up too. The blood in the car, it doesn't come into your story at all, does it?
No, we didn't follow that line. We wanted to stick to finding out exactly what happened on that night and follow certain leads that we had. Of course, there were two hypotheses put up at the trial. One was in respect to the Chamberlains, their version of it. The other was in respect to the version of the Crown. Now, one judge at the appeal said that there was reasonable doubt in respect to the evidence of the blood. I say that the jury were allowed to believe whatever version that they wanted to. Now, we don't know what the jury decided, whether they decided for the Chamberlains or against. There was certainly evidence of the evidence that there could be children's blood or even Azaria's blood because of vomit, etc., in the car.
There's one factor that has never come to court, that on the night of Azaria's death, the nurse in charge of the government nurse medical aid station at Ayers Rock recommended that Chamberlains did not stay in their tent that night. It was a bitterly cold night and she was worried that they would get shocked. She arranged a motel room for them, and Mrs. Chamberlain and the children were taken to that motel room earlier in the night. And then at around about 11:30 to 12 o'clock, the nurse went with Mr. Michael Chamberlain there, and she went in the car, which theoretically there has a murder just been committed in. There was no resistance to her going in that car, and yet Mr. Chamberlain was supposed to be an accessory after the fact. He would have known it. He wouldn't have let her in the car if there'd been murder in there. And she has said in her affidavit, though this has not come out in court, that she is a trained nurse. She can smell fresh blood if it is there, and there was no smell of fresh blood in the car that night. The other forensic evidence, for example, the clothing at the other end of Ayers Rock, the clothing was found about 4 miles away from where the tent was. We believe that when the body was dug up from the backyard, the people were already starting to panic because there were already claims of human intervention. And being a long way from the media, they didn't know how the media were interpreting that. There's 300 miles to the nearest radio or television station, and newspapers are very expensive, so very few newspapers get in there. And they were just hearing this talk of human intervention. And they knew that human intervention meant them. So when they dug the body up, which is very dangerous to leave in their backyard for too long, particularly since dingoes will dig down to 6 feet, and the dingoes would dig up the body, they removed the clothing and dumped it at the other end of Ayers Rock so it would be found. People would say, well, there's the clothing, the body's been eaten, and that's the end of the case. But they dumped it there so clumsily that human intervention became more obvious rather than less obvious.
But just how much of your story is supposition? I believe that part would have to be. You have no evidence, I gather, or no statements from people to substantiate it.
There was no evidence that Mrs. Chamberlain was the one who put it there, or Pastor Chamberlain, and yet that was considered significant evidence in the trial. And the same would happen in a trial of conspiracy for these people. I found out about this, the police reopening the case about a little over a week ago. What happened is I was ready to fly to Central Australia the following day to lay a private prosecution against the 3 of the people involved on conspiracy to pervert the course of justice, inasmuch as they concealed the identity of the dingo which took Azaria from the tent. Before I went, we rang Northern Territory Police and I told them what we were planning. Said, look, I won't, I just won't know if they're going to cut across anything that you're doing. And we found out that they'd reopened the investigation, so we didn't proceed. But our barrister has given us a written opinion that says that the evidence that we have is clearly sufficient to win the case. In his opinion, it's a beyond all reasonable doubt case. And even in the length of time that we're discussing tonight, we don't have time to go through every little piece, but when all the pieces in the jigsaw are mounted in, the evidence against these people is stronger than the evidence against Lindy Chamberlain by a long way.
Okay, where will you go from here? Now, you've given this information to the Northern Territory Police, and we all understand that some new investigation is going on. Suppose that doesn't bring any result.
Well, I believe it will bring a result because I know how strong the evidence is. And I have no reason to question the integrity of the Northern Territory Police. I think that they will come to the verdict based on the evidence.
But we've had a very long investigation. We've had 2 inquests, a trial and an appeal. And Mrs. Chamberlain is now in jail. Yeah. At this stage, 3 years later, after all that's happened, how confident can you be that you can get Mrs. Chamberlain out of jail, which surely must be your whole aim?
Yes, I'm very confident of it. I believe that the Territory Police will come to the similar conclusion that we've come to on the evidence, and what our barristers have advised us would be the legal position with it. However, should they not come to that conclusion, I'll be back to Alice Springs to lay a private prosecution against individuals on the conspiracy charge, which I'm, as a citizen, entitled to do.
I might say that Chief Superintendent Plum, the last time that we were in Darwin, we spoke to him and we showed him a videotape of certain evidence that we had, interviews with witnesses, and he sat very quietly through that, and it was evidence from the Aboriginal black trackers. We indicated that we had people who said that the Aboriginal people aren't very reliable, they have problems with their language. He said, well, I don't see any problem with this Aboriginal's evidence. And the last thing he said before he left his office was, well, gentlemen, it looks like I'll be flying south very shortly to go back into the investigation.
And he has done that?
In fact, he
well, we don't know. He's on long service leave until the 1st of September, so we've been told. He may be on long service leave, he may not be, I don't know.
In fact, he did start the investigation, though. Yeah.
Mr. Ward, I'd like to come almost back to the beginning and talk about your relations with the Chamberlains. Have you seen Mrs. Chamberlain recently?
I haven't seen Mrs. Chamberlain since I visited her in Berrima Jail in November last year.
Have you seen Mr. Chamberlain recently?
I don't think I have, Murray.
Do you have any idea of how they feel about what you've been doing?
I've spoken to Mr. Chamberlain on the phone, and he's made some comments about it, yes.
Last time you went public with information about this particular case, the story of the Aborigine a few months ago, that was when the appeal was pending. The first appeal was pending.
Right.
And I believe that you contacted the Chamberlains and they rejected your help at that stage. Why was that? Why was your information then not used in the appeal, the original appeal?
I don't think it's right to say that I contacted the Chamberlains and they rejected it, Ray. It was more, I think it was the lawyers chose not to use it. Why they chose not to use it, I don't know.
All of this has taken you months of your time and a good deal of travel and expense. Who's been paying for it all?
I have.
How much does it cost?
The records show it's cost me $70,000, but how much it's cost me from lost business because I wasn't at work, I couldn't guess.
They must be wonderful friends of yours.
I suppose.
I think really the point Murray's getting at is your motive.
Oh, right.
Are you determined to prove that the Chamberlains aren't guilty of the offences they've been convicted of? Is that your whole aim? And that you won't stop until you've done that?
Well, that's how it stands now, Ray. It didn't start that way. It started out to find out if a story about an Aborigine burying the baby was correct. It was something I thought would take 2 weeks, and anyone could give 2 weeks of their life to do that. And from that first 2 weeks, we gained a little bit of information and a bit more, and it was a very slow, piecemeal effect. Now, you can remember when we had that interview here in these studios last December.
About the Aborigine?
Yeah, and of course the other material as well.
He is now no longer part of the story.
That's right. It took us to mid-January to find out that that wasn't so. Now, the Northern Territory Police have obviously taken it over, you won't find anyone more objective than they. In fact, you might even suggest that they would not want to overturn their previous verdict.
And a final question. Assuming that they hear all your new evidence and decide to take no further action, what then?
I'll go to Central Australia and relay the charges myself.